About how many people do you think will be listening to this?
We saw like 180 in the auditorium, and we don't know how many on YouTube.
They're joining. They're joining now. So
They're joining now, and
we'll start. Hola a todos. La ciencia no conoce país, porque el conocimiento pertenece a la humanidad y es la antorcha que ilumina el mundo. Louis Pasteur. Dom Science es el evento anual liderado por el capítulo estudiantil SPI de la Universidad de Afid, formado por más de 100 estudiantes apasionados por la investigación y divulgación de la física, la astronomía, la medicina, la biología, la geología y a grandes rasgos, la ciencia en todos sus aspectos. Esta semana, desde el 25 hasta el 29 de octubre, contaremos con una excelente programación de eventos y actividades presenciales y virtuales para todos los públicos, apoyados por científicos, instituciones, académicos locales e internacionales y, por supuesto, nuestra universidad y cada uno de los integrantes que conforman nuestro grupo, todos unidos en la importante tarea de hacer la ciencia accesible para todos. Finalmente, nuestra experiencia en eventos virtuales durante estos últimos años nos ha dicho que existe la posibilidad de experimentar algunas dificultades técnicas y si esto sucede, haremos lo mejor para resolverlo en el menor tiempo posible. Muchas gracias a todos por su paciencia y su comprensión. Ahora me emociona mucho presentarles a nuestra conferencia inaugural. El doctor Bob Blackkowicz fue el ganador del premio Nobel de química en el año 2012 por su increíble trabajo en los receptores acoplados a las proteínas G. Estos son los receptores moleculares en la superficie de las células que controlan todas las funciones de nuestro cuerpo. A día de hoy, aproximadamente la mitad de todos los medicamentos que se utilizan en la actualidad utilizan este tipo de receptor. Pueden adquirir A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to Stockholm en el enlace dispuesto en la descripción de la transmisión. En él, no solo encontrará el viaje del Dr. Lefkowitz en el mundo de la ciencia, sino que también apoyarán a las librerías independientes. Dale.
¿sigo yo?
Dale.
Okay. Now I'm going to do an introduction in English. So, hello everyone. Science knows no country because knowledge belongs to humanity, and it's the torch which illuminates the world. Louis Pasteur. Jump Science is the annual event led by the student chapter SPIE of Avid University, formed by more than 100 students passionate about research and disseminations of physics, astronomy, medicine, biology, geology, and broadly speaking, science in all its aspects. This week, from 25th to 29th of October, we will have an excellent program of face-to-face and virtual events and activities for all audiences, supported by scientists, institutions, local and international academics and of course our university and each of the members that make our group all united in the important task of making science accessible to all. Finally, our experience in virtual events tell us that there is the possibility of experiencing some technical difficulties. If this happens, we will do our best to solve it and in the shortest time possible. Thank you very much for your patience and understanding. And now, I am very excited to introduce you to our inaugural lecturer, Dr. Bob Blackkowicz. Dr. Bob was the winner of the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 2012 for his amazing work on G-protein coupled receptors. These are the molecular receptors on the surface of the cells that control all of our body functions. As of today, about half of the medications in use today use this type of receptor. You can purchase A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to Stockholm and in the link provided in the transmission, in which you will not only find the journey of Dr. Lefkowitz in the world of science, but also support independent bookstores. That's it. The digital podium is all yours, Doctor.
Doctor?
Yeah, are you ready for me?
Yeah, we're ready for you.
Okay, thank you. So Happy to be with you today. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my career, which stretches now over 50 years doing science and medicine, and tell you a little bit about my story, which I call A Tale of Two Callings, and see if we can pry from this story one or two pieces of advice that may be helpful to you. So I'm calling my talk A Tale of Two Callings. I'm assuming you know what we mean by the term a calling. It's something we normally associate with clergy, but it can really be associated with any vocation or avocation, and simply refers to a deep-seated sense that one is meant or destined to do a particular thing. I've been particularly fortunate in my career to have had two callings. The first was one I experienced at a very young age, although of course I wasn't familiar with the idea of a calling. And it was inspired by this man. His name is Dr. Joseph Feibusch, and he was a general practitioner of medicine in the Bronx, New York City. He was my family physician. He made house calls, and when either I or a member of my family was ill, and I was totally taken with him. He knew all this special information that other people did not know. He carried this black bag from which he could produce all manner of seemingly magical instruments like a stethoscope, an otoscope, and his prescription pad. Let me play with these things and the stethoscope. And so by the age of, say 7 or 8, that's me, I was completely convinced that, like Dr. Feibusch, I would someday be a physician. And that was the driving goal of the early phase of my life. I never wavered from that. I went to a special public high school for gifted and talented high school students in New York City who were interested in math and science. And the only criterion for admission was your score on a competitive examination. From Bronx Science, I went on to Columbia College, where I was a chemistry major and a pre-medical student, and then on to Columbia Medical School in New York City, shown here with my parents at my medical school graduation in 1966. Alas, my dad, shown there on the right, would die 2 years after this photograph was taken at the young age of 63 of his fourth heart attack. My mother also developed early heart disease, and it was because of this, I have no doubt, that I ultimately decided to pursue a career in clinical cardiology. This is a picture of me as a house officer. I'm pointing to it with my cursor. That's me as an intern in 1966-67. I would have gone on to happily complete my clinical training and practice medicine and cardiology for the rest of my career, were it not for one glaring occurrence. And let me point out that to this point in my career, I had never done any research, not in college, not in high school, not in medical school. Even though in medical school we had numerous opportunities to do research electives, I never did them. I always did clinical electives, wanting to sharpen my clinical skills as much as I could, as quickly as I could. But as I said, I would have happily gone on to complete my training in medicine, which is what I wanted to do, were it not for a cataclysmic occurrence, the Vietnam War, which would occupy the United States throughout the 1960s and into the 1970s. It was a very unpopular war. There were demonstrations, there were riots, and many of us did not want to support the war in any way. There was a lottery draft for all men over 18. That meant upon turning 18, every male got a number, and then depending on what numbers were pulled essentially out of a drum, determined whether you were drafted and were sent to Vietnam or left alone. But for physicians, there was no lottery. All physicians were drafted upon graduation from medical school, and you had to serve for 2 years. Most of us were able to get another 1 or 2 year deferment to do an internship and at least 1 year of residency. But then you were drafted into the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, or the United States Public Health Service. And you could pretty much well be assured of spending 1 of your 2 years of conscripted service in Vietnam as a physician. There was only one legal way around that fate, and that was to be drafted into the United States Public Health Service. And the reason that might get you out of serving in Vietnam is that the United States Public Health Service supplied physicians throughout the United States to federal institutions such as the National Institutes of Health, the Communicable Disease Center, jails, Indian reservations, etc. As you can imagine, everybody wanted to get the commission in the United States Public Health Service. And there were extraordinary competition to get these commissions for obvious reasons. I was fortunate in that I had high academic standing, good letters of recommendation, etc. I was successful. I got the commission as a lieutenant commander in the Public Health Service and was assigned to the NIH for 2 years, where I spent about 20% of my time doing clinical work, taking care of patients who were in the NIH for various clinical research studies, and the other 80% assigned to a research laboratory to learn how to do research. This shows me in 1968 as a young researcher at the NIH. And here at the NIH, I experienced something which I had never experienced before: failure, prolonged, protracted failure. I had never failed at anything that I had tried in my life to this point for any significantly prolonged period of time. And yet here at the NIH, I found that despite my very best efforts, I could not make progress with my research problem. I became rather depressed about that. And this further convinced me that research would play no part in my career and that I was destined for a career in clinical medicine. And so I made arrangements that at the end of my 2-year stay in the NIH, I would move on to Boston, to the Massachusetts General Hospital at Harvard to finish my clinical training in medicine and cardiology. As luck would have it, during my last 6 months at the NIH, I finally made some progress. I published my first few scientific papers, got a taste of what success at research was like. I enjoyed it, of course, but I was far from convinced that research would play a part in my career. And so at the end of my 2 years at the NIH, and against the advice of my 2 mentors who wanted me to stay and continue with my research, I moved to the Massachusetts General Hospital to complete my clinical training. That's me in about 1970 or 71 as a senior medical resident at the Massachusetts General Hospital. When I arrived there, I threw myself into the clinical work again, enjoyed it very much. But after about 6 months of that intense full-time clinical work, I realized that I felt unsettled and that something seemed to be missing. Much as I enjoyed the clinical work, it was not completely fulfilling to me. And after I reflected on this for a while, I began to realize that the problem was I actually missed being in the laboratory and doing research. And so I found myself a mentor at the Mass General and began working part-time in his laboratory, which I did for the remaining 2.5 years in Boston, even while finishing my clinical training. Although I didn't make all that much progress in my research while I was there, I did realize that, I absolutely have to be doing research if I'm going to be fully content with what I'm doing. And so it was then that this second calling, a calling to do scientific research, began to emerge. When I finished at the Massachusetts General Hospital in 1973, I was offered a very nice position as a junior faculty member at Duke University in Durham, North Carolina, which I accepted. And over the next several years, I split my time between being a clinician, shown here, mainly doing cardiology and internal medicine, and establishing my laboratory program, as shown here with one of my postdoctoral fellows. Initially, I would say that the mix of activities, the first year or two, was probably about 40% of my time in the clinic and maybe 60% of my time establishing the laboratory. But within a year, the laboratory work began to take off very quickly. And I found myself spending more and more time in the lab and less time in the clinic. And within, I would say, 3 to 5 years, I was spending probably 80 or 85% of my time in the lab and only about 15% of the time in the clinics. So what was I doing? Over the next 50 years, I would work on receptors, as you heard, for hormones and drugs. And we made a great deal of progress over the years. This is a slide taken from the Nobel lecture of the discoverer of cyclic AMP. And his name was Earl Sutherland. I'm sure you've all heard of cyclic AMP, the so-called second messenger of hormone signaling. He discovered that hormones like adrenaline and glucagon could stimulate this enzyme, which was located in the membrane of cells, leading to the production of cyclic AMP, which would then diffuse into the cell and lead to all kinds of physiological actions. But notice that in his scheme, there was no such thing as a receptor. He envisaged the hormones as working directly on the hormone, on the enzyme itself. So for this Nobel Prize winner, there was no such thing as a receptor. But today, due to my own work and those of many laboratories, we realize, of course, that the first step in hormone or drug or neurotransmitter action is, in fact, the interaction of these molecules with highly specific cellular receptors. We envisage them much as a lock and a key, where the key is the drug or neurotransmitter and the lock is the receptor. And the key can only fit in the lock if there is some very exact complementarity in their structures, much as a key fits into a lock to turn it. Well, we discovered in the 70s and 80s a huge family of cellular receptors called G protein coupled receptors because they signal by activating a second type of transducer protein called a G protein, which stands for guanine nucleotide regulatory protein. There are somewhere around 800 of these different types of these receptors, and they regulate virtually all known physiological processes in humans, including a number of our sensory modalities, such as taste and smell and vision, as well as just about everything else. And as you heard, they are an extraordinarily large class of drug targets. I'm not going to go through what we know about G protein coupled receptors today. It's a lot of information, and it's summarized on this slide. But the bottom line is that the receptors to which I'm pointing, and which have this characteristic 7-membrane spanning domain arrangement shown here in a crystal structure, and there are now crystal structures of literally over 100 different of these receptors. But the receptors can interact either with a G protein, shown here on the left side of the slide, leading to generation of second messengers and cellular responses, or in an alternate pathway, they can be phosphorylated by a small family of enzymes called G protein coupled receptor kinases, which then leads to the binding of a second protein called beta-arrestin, which gets in the way of the G protein binding and leads to desensitization or diminution of cellular signaling. Interestingly, we subsequently learned that these beta-arrestins despite the fact that they're turning off G protein signaling, can do a number of other things, like leading to internalization of the receptors, or they can even serve as cellular signaling systems in their own right, seemingly somewhat counterintuitive for a protein discovered as the basis for desensitization of G protein signaling and actually named arrestin for arresting or stopping cellular signaling. Now, as you heard, the members of the G protein coupled receptor family are by far the largest family of drug targets. There are over 700 different drugs used in the United States, approved by the FDA, which target these receptors either as agonists, that's stimulators, or antagonists, that's blockers. They include some of the commonest drugs in use, so-called beta blockers, angiotensin receptor blockers, antihistamines, adrenaline, glucagon. It goes on and on and on. And so the impact of the work on clinical therapeutics has been very, very large indeed, even though the work was carried out at a basic fundamental level. It did in the end have a great deal of clinical impact. Now, in my long career, which, as I say, goes back probably about 55 years, I've learned a couple of things. Let me pass a few of them along to you about some keys to success in science and quite possibly in other things. And I could spend hours going over these things. I don't have the time. Let me just list some of them for you. I always tell my students and fellows that there are 4 keys to success in research. The first is focus. The second is focus. The third is focus. And the fourth you have to figure out for yourself. I tell them to build their careers around scientific problems that interest you, not around techniques or groups of techniques. All techniques are ultimately replaced by more modern, updated techniques, which are even more powerful. So if you tie your career to any specific technique exclusively, you're pretty much guaranteeing you'll have a pretty short career. Do lots of experiments. Among the trainees I've had who were the most successful, a fairly general characteristic has been that they did more experiments than the average trainee. Don't talk yourself out of experiments too easily. Even if you have numerous reasons why an experiment won't work, consider doing it anyway. Often, you'll be surprised at the result. Be bold, take risks, and don't be afraid to fail. Failure, especially early in one's career, seems to me an almost universal hallmark of everyone who has ultimately gone on to be successful. Learn to tell a good story. I always tell people that data are not a story. Data are just data. But assembling data into the best possible story, the most coherent and compelling story, is a crucial part not only of research and scientific endeavors, but also in the clinics, where putting together the clinical facts of a case to tell the story of their illness can be the key to a successful diagnosis. Be ambitious. Try to view your work as play. Try to see the humor in everyday situations. If you have the right attitude, it's all around you. I find that humor is a great prod to creativity, and I try to leaven my lab and other meetings with a generous amount. This is an interesting subject in its own right. I don't have time to talk about it in any detail, but I think there's a very close relationship between humor and scientific discovery. Both involve seeing relations between seemingly disparate and initially unconnected events or concepts. And then in putting them together in science, we can often make a discovery. In putting them together in a different setting, we can see that a situation is humorous as soon as we appreciate a relationship that otherwise was not apparent. In other words, in that moment, when you see the joke that somebody is making, you're essentially making a small discovery. Be enthusiastic about what you're doing. If you're not, find something else to do. When new people come to the lab, I always tell them there are two conditions that are necessary but not sufficient for you to succeed here. First, you're enthusiastic about your project. Second, I'm enthusiastic about your project. Be optimistic and be doggedly persistent. I think if you can develop many of these attributes, it doesn't guarantee that you'll be successful, but I certainly think it can contribute to your success. Now, the things I've just been telling you about, these keys to success, are things that I think a successful mentor passes along to his or her mentees, students and fellows. And I want to stress to you just how important I think the mentoring experience is. In fact, I would argue that for those of you who are going into science or perhaps other fields, there's probably nothing more important than the mentors that you work with, either as your graduate student advisors or your postdoctoral advisors, etc. I think the decision as to who your mentors will be is a much more significant and important decision than, for example, where you go to school or where you do your clinical training if you're becoming a physician. Now, the importance of mentorship, I think, is apparent in what we often refer to as scientific lineages. In other words, scientific family trees, if you will. Let me give you a specific and very dramatic example. When I was at the NIH in 1968, as I said, I was part of a very select group of young physicians, most of us without any scientific experience at all, who were basically sent to the NIH to work there in the laboratories of very successful scientists. Remarkably, from this relatively small group of young physicians who went to the NIH during this period, emerged an entire generation of academic physician scientists these are my peers and my colleagues who went to the NIH at about the same time that I did. This is a chart which shows the following, that in the period between 1964 and 1972, which were the peak years of the Vietnam War, no fewer than 10 future Nobel laureates would emerge from that program. Those 10 Nobel laureates, including myself, are shown in this yellow band. And the fact that their names are encased in a blue rectangle is meant to indicate that these are Nobel laureates. Now, in the lines above them are their scientific parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, and back for many generations. Again, everyone colored blue is a Nobel laureate. So first of all, note that for 4 of these 10 future Nobel laureates, they actually trained with a Nobel laureate. And for the other 6 of us, you don't have to go back any further than a scientific grandparent to find a Nobel laureate. Some lineages are stunning. Here's one where just every generation except one seems to be a Nobel laureate. And the one who isn't, Earl Statman, was one of the premier biochemists of his day, and in turn trained not 1, but 2 Nobel laureates, and also trained this man, Paston, who also trained 2 Nobel laureates. And if you go back 4 or 5 generations, you get to Nobel Prize winning physicists like Schrödinger, Chadwick, Bohr, Pauling, even though all of us down here were obviously biomedical scientists. And I think lineages like this, and this is just an example, are significant evidence for the importance of scientific lineages and of mentoring in particular in creating these lineages. Obviously, there are things that can be passed from one generation to the next, which help determine success in science. And I suspect one would find very similar professional family trees in other walks of life and in other professions. Now, I've had a number of amazing experiences in my career, and I've gotten to meet remarkable people. And I thought I would finish up by just telling you a few stories about some of the remarkable people I have worked with. So this is a picture taken in the 1990s. Some of you may recognize, well, this is me, obviously, a much younger version of me. Wondering if any of you know who that is. That's Tony Fauci, who's in the news a lot these days because of his work on the pandemic in the United States. He's really become a world leader in the public health area. He was at the NIH together with me in the same program from 1968 to 1970, the exact class that I was in. In fact, that class, in addition to Tony Fauci, produced, and this is again out of like maybe 50 to 100 people in the program, produced that one class who went from 68 to 70, in other words, who graduated medical school in 66, produced 4 Nobel laureates, myself, Harold Varmus, Mike Brown, Joe Goldstein, and also Tony Fauci. I got to meet President George Bush a number of years ago when I received the National Medal of Science at a White House ceremony. Of course, I got to meet the King of Sweden when I received the Nobel Prize from his hand in 2012. I got to meet President Obama in 2012 as part of a long-standing tradition, I think of more than 60 years. This has to do with the fact that lo these many years, I think dating back to President Dwight Eisenhower, that it became a custom for the United States president to greet and receive all American Nobel laureates as they were on their way to Sweden to receive their prizes. And in my year, there were 5 of us, and we were all graciously received by President Obama in the Oval Office, and we had a wonderful time together with him. He's warm, friendly. Interestingly, during the 4 years that President Trump was president of the United States, he abrogated this longstanding tradition and never once met with any Nobel laureates. I also had an amazing experience where after I had received the call from Stockholm on October 10th, 2012, informing me of the Nobel Prize, I received a phone call from Coach K, Coach Mike Krzyzewski. I don't know whether you folks follow American basketball. I sure hope so. But Coach Mike Krzyzewski, the Duke basketball coach, is the winningest coach in college men's basketball in history. Over 1,000 wins, I believe. Anyway, he called me up to congratulate me. I did not know him at that time. And he said, Bob, I'm really thrilled that you have brought us this great honor. He says, you know, I feel a certain affinity for you because you may recall I brought Duke our very first NCAA men's basketball championship. And now you've brought the university its very first Nobel Prize. So I'd like you to come down to Cameron Indoor Stadium, that's where our team plays, next week and be honored. And so I did. And as you can see, that honor consisted of bringing me to center court and receiving my own jersey with my name and the number 1. Here's me together with Coach K. It's interesting, you see my hands are up at that point, and you can see the students who sit closest to the court. It's sort of traditional for the students to chant things at opposing basketball players, typically when they're fouling out of a game. But in any case, while I stood there, I could hear the students chanting, but I couldn't quite make out what they were saying, but they were pointing at me. And gradually, it kind of came into focus in my hearing. They were pointing at me, and in unison, they were chanting, "He's so smart. He's so smart." Obviously, that was a big kick. That's me getting a big hug from the famous coach, Mike Krzyzewski. You can see the jersey and the number 1. But that's not where the story ends. In 2015, 3 years later, Coach Krzyzewski and the team won their 5th NCAA championship, and they were invited to the White House to celebrate with President Obama, who you may or may not know was a huge college basketball fan. And this picture appeared in the Duke Chronicle, which is the student-run campus newspaper, which I saw. And here you can see everybody beaming, and they have presented the coach with a basketball and with his own jersey with the number 1. I was not amused by that. There's a long-standing tradition at Duke that when a jersey number, any outstanding player, and there have been only a few in history, but when a player is really outstanding, when he graduates, they retire his number and they hang it from the rafters, from the ceiling in the Card Gymnasium. Feeling that that was appropriate, after I had received my jersey 3 years before, I hung it from the rafters in my office. I hung it from the ceiling. You can see it there. Actually, I'm standing between the jersey and my Nobel Prize, which is to my right. So I was not amused when my jersey number 1 was being given away. Granted, it was to the President of the United States. So by then I had become a friend of Coach K. And so I immediately sent him a text or an email, I don't recall, saying, "Hey, Coach, I'm thrilled that the team won the 5th championship. I'm thrilled that you got to meet the president and give him a jersey. But I'm really not happy that you gave away my jersey number to the president, when in fact that jersey number has been retired and is currently hanging from the rafters in my office." Within an hour, he wrote me back. He said, "Bob, look, I'm so apologetic." He says, "But you have to understand, this was the President of the United States. I just had to do it." He said, "But look, you know, and I know, you're the real number 1. So what could I say? I wrote back, "Coach, all is forgiven." Another interesting experience that I had was something that a number of Nobel laureates get to do, and that's throw out the first pitch at a baseball game. So I don't know how popular baseball is in Colombia. As you probably know, it's the so-called national pastime in the United States. And we often honor people by having them throw out the first pitch. Well, we have a AAA minor league team in Durham, North Carolina, called the Durham Bulls. And they invited me as an honor to throw out the first pitch at a game at which I was honored the summer after I won the Nobel Prize. And fortunately, they gave me plenty of warning because at the time I was about 70 years old. Although I played a lot of ball when I was a young man, I actually hadn't thrown or caught a baseball in decades. But fortunately, they gave me a couple of months warning. And so I started practicing to make sure I wouldn't embarrass myself. And it was a good thing, too, because when I first started, I could barely throw a ball 60 feet. And if I did throw it 60 feet, it was completely wild. But I just kept working at it. And one of my granddaughters, who pitched for her team in San Francisco, gave me some wonderful pointers. Every day at noon, I would go down to a courtyard near my lab and throw with whoever was willing to catch me from the lab. Then during the final week before the game, I called up the Duke varsity baseball pitching coach and asked if he would work with me so that I could get some experience throwing off the mound. And so the big day came. We had a ceremony honoring me from left to right. This is Wool E. Bull, the team mascot, myself, Victor Zhao, who was at the time the CEO of Duke Medical Center, and with the microphone, Mr. William Bell, the long-standing mayor of Durham. So now the big moment arrived, and it was time for me to take my one shot at glory. And so here I was, and I'm going to show you a video of what happened. I want you to watch carefully. It's hard to follow the trajectory of the ball, but try to watch especially where the catcher catches it. That's me walking out to the mound. You can see me on the Jumbotron in the background. If you saw that, he caught it right at his waist. It was a perfect strike. And then came one of the really great moments of my life. The catcher came out and handed me the ball, put it in my hand, looked me in the eye and said, quote, "Doc, that was one hell of a throw." And what can I tell you? It doesn't get much better than that. Here's another experience that I'm not going to tell you about, but I'll tell you how you can learn more about. This shows me together with two other aging rockers. This one is Sting, and this one is Peter Gabriel. I don't know if you've heard long before your time, but maybe you've heard of Sting. I don't know. So you're probably wondering, why in the world are these two aging rockers kneeling in a show of homage or respect for Dr. Lefkowitz? Well, I'll tell you in a minute how you can find out. I want to give you one last piece of advice before I wrap it up. This is a graph taken from an article which, ironically, appeared in the New England Journal of Medicine, probably the single highest prestige clinical journal of research. And interestingly, it appeared on October 10th, 2012, the very day that I received word from Stockholm that I was winning the Nobel Prize. I did not become aware of this article until 8 or 10 months later. And it's called Chocolate Consumption, Cognitive Function, and Nobel Laureates. And what it purports to show on the abscissa is the chocolate consumption in different countries per capita. And on the ordinate, the number of Nobel laureates per 10 million population in the same countries. Each data point is a flag representing the country in particular. And what you can see is that there's an almost perfect correlation between the amount of chocolate consumed in a country per capita and the number of Nobel Prizes. Perhaps the only real exception off the line is Sweden itself, which seems to have more Nobel Prizes than would be predicted based on their chocolate consumption, which may in fact suggests that maybe they are cooking the books a little bit, or maybe showing a little favoritism towards themselves. So why am I showing you this? Well, the fact of the matter is, I have been a devotee of dark chocolate for most of my adult life. And in general, for years, I would consume 2 small squares of dark chocolate, usually at least 75% cocoa, a couple of nights a week. But then, true story, in the summer of 2012, I said to my wife, you know, I'm doing fine. My weight is good. My cholesterol is good. I'm 70 years old. Why don't I treat myself? I mean, why am I limiting myself to having chocolate only 2 nights a week? I'm going to go ahead and move up and start having it every night. And she said, you should do it. You deserve it. And so sometime in the summer of 12, either July or August, I began eating my 2 squares of dark chocolate 7 nights a week. Facts of the matter are, 2 months later, I won the Nobel Prize. So what can we conclude from that? Well, I think the first thing is that there's obviously a threshold phenomenon here. It's dose related, and you have to get above 2 nights a week, 2 doses a week. But the most stunning thing is that it's obviously very rapidly acting, such that within 2 months of increasing my dose, I won the prize. So I suggest to all of you who might aspire to win a Nobel Prize someday, you might want to think seriously about trying the dark chocolate. Now, if you've enjoyed any of the stories I've been telling you, you can find those and many, many more in my memoir that was published this year. It's called A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to Stockholm. It's filled with science. It's filled with humor. It's not intended for scientists. It's a book for anybody who's interested in what the life of a physician scientist is like. And if you want to know how I happen to be hanging out with Sting and Peter Gabriel, you'll find that and many other stories in this book. Well, I've enjoyed regaling you with some of my tales, and I would be happy to take any questions or comments that you have. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing at this point.
Okay, thank you so much, Doctor. There is the screen of the auditorium. All the students are watching you. So we select 3 questions for you. And the first one is, many of us are considering a career in science, but we are having many doubts about the balance between academic and personal life. How have you managed to have such an excellent but time-demanding career while maintaining your personal life?
This is, I get this question from time to time, and it's an extraordinarily difficult one. It really is. It's the question of work-life balance. As you can imagine, I did not achieve what I achieved in my lifetime by working an 8-hour day. Let's face it, I was driven throughout my career trying to solve these problems about receptors. Nonetheless, I did help raise 5 children, and I have 6 grandchildren. The family's always been very, very important to me. I think each person has to work out their own personal way of handling this. You know, when I was a young person coming through, 2 career families were really an exception. There was a traditional model where men, went out to do the work and the women stayed home and raised the family. And of course, I must say that made it much easier for the men who were going out to, win the daily bread, so to speak, because they had a partner who was largely taking care of domestic things. Today, things are entirely different. Virtually all scientists, young scientists and middle-aged scientists that I know are part of 2 career families, generally 2 equal careers. most often two scientists married to each other, and they split the child rearing and domestic activities pretty much 50-50. And that works very well. Can you have careers like this? Well, I don't think there's any question about it. The rewards are extraordinary. Every time you make a discovery, it's just an amazing high. And knowing in the long run that the discoveries that you've made may have favorably affected the outcome of patients' lives is more gratifying than I can begin to tell you. I mean, I set out to be a physician. I had no concept that I would ever become a scientist. But, I look back on it and I say, well, had I gone ahead with my initial plan, I might have touched the lives of, in a long career, thousands of patients. But the way things turned out, I've touched the lives of many millions of patients with my research through the drugs that have been developed. So I would encourage anybody who's interested in a career in science to go for it. And if you're interested in a career as a physician science, all the better. So those are my thoughts on work-life balance.
We have another question for you. This is from the audience. It's from Daniela Posada. And it's, what experiences do you feel that define your way of seeing science? And what were the most difficult moments you have to go through to get where you are today?
The most difficult thing, I think, about being a scientist is learning that if you're going to do this, failure will be your constant companion. Failure is basically what we do 98% of the time. I remember when I was at the NIH, and that was the most difficult period of my life. The question, what was the most difficult thing you had to overcome? Without a doubt, it was that year and a half of total abject failure at the NIH. And when I was in the depths of despair about just how badly things were going, I was having lunch one day, and a senior scientist, not my mentor, but in the same branch, who knew that I was suffering, came over and sat down with me. We got to chatting, and he knew I was pretty down. And he said, "Bob, do you know the difference between an absolutely outstanding scientist and your run-of-the-mill one?" I said, "No." He says, "Well, what percentage of the time do you think the average scientist succeeds in what he's doing?" I said, "I have no idea." He said, "Maybe 1%. He says, "What do you think the percentage is for an all-star?" He says, "A possible Nobel laureate. How often do you think he succeeds?" I said, "I don't know." He said, "It could be as high as 2%. And that really impressed me, and I've remembered it to this day, making the point that even for the most outstanding scientists, 98% of the time, they're going to be failing. Or more has been my experience. So getting used to that failure is, I think, the most difficult thing. But I can tell you this. I've heard talks in my life by some of the most successful people in the world, not just in science, but from all walks of life, the military, law, entertainment, sports, you name it. The common link in every one of their career talks is how early in their careers they had to deal with failure after failure after failure before ultimately succeeding. I think it's worth bearing that in mind. So if you pursue a career in science, you will fail. But that failure is in the service of ultimate success. And you just have to stick with it and learn from each failure about how to construct a better experiment and a better experiment and a better experiment. So I think failure is the key concept to emphasize there.
We have another question by the audience. Which are the keys for being successful in science? And would you apply these keys also to real life? What will you change or add?
What would I change or add from that list? Well, I guess I wouldn't add anything. I'm sure there are many things that one could add. Are there any things that I would change? Well, I don't have the list in front of me, so I got nothing for you there.
Okay, we have another, maybe a common question for you. And how did you feel after winning the Nobel Prize?
That's an excellent question. Receiving that call is something that very few people get to experience. And understandably, people are always very interested in what is it like. First of all, it comes in the middle of the night because for those of us, certainly in the Americas, the Stockholm is 5 or 6 hours ahead, and they have the announcement at about 11:30 or 12 in the afternoon. And they like to let the laureates know about an hour before the ceremony. So if you live on the East Coast of the United States, as I do, you'll get the call around 5 a.m. If you live on the West Coast, as my co-winner, Brian Kobilka, who was a trainee of mine in the 80s, he got the call at 2 a.m. It's even crazier. But, I had a long and kind of tortured history with the Nobel Prize because I won the prize when I was almost 70. But people had started talking about my being a contender for the prize when I was about 50. And so for 20 years, people were always wondering, well, is this the year that Bob is going to win? Or they would be asking me, Bob, is this the year you're going to win? Or when do you think you're going to win? When are you finally going to win? And that, I must say, that became somewhat dispiriting because the years went by and I didn't win. But then, so people say, well, were you surprised when you got the call? And the answer I generally give is, well, yes and no. So why no? Well, people for 20 years had been asking me, when are you going to win the prize? Or telling me you're definitely going to win the prize. So it couldn't come as a total surprise. I had heard from multiple sources that I had been nominated. But yes, I was surprised. So why was I surprised? Well, first of all, as you know, the prizes are given out each year, announced each year in a set order by discipline. Monday is medicine, Tuesday's physics, Wednesday's chemistry, etc. Well, Monday had come and gone. And obviously, if I was ever going to win, it would be in medicine. And now here was the phone ringing on Wednesday. So that was a surprise. The other surprise was that I hadn't picked up any rumors. I mean, there's quite a grapevine in science, especially in high-level science. And every year there are rumors, oh, so-and-so's going to win, so-and-so's going to win. Sometimes they're right, sometimes they're wrong. Hadn't picked up anything, not a word. So when that phone rang at 5 o'clock in the morning, I can assure you, I was fast asleep. And in fact, I didn't even hear the phone because I sleep with earplugs. But my wife did, and she picked it up. So she kind of knew before me. And then she sort of, gave me a little poke in the ribs. And she said, Bob, there's a woman from Stockholm calling. And she said she wants to speak to Professor Lefkowitz. Well, I figured that would be it. And in fact, they very quickly gave me the news. But interestingly, my reaction was not one of whoop-de-doo, jumping up and down, doing a dance. Not at all. It was more one of quiet satisfaction and almost a sense of a monkey is off my back. And thinking to myself, never again in my life will I ever have to answer the question, Bob, when are you going to win the Nobel Prize? And that was a very nice feeling.
I think that those are all the questions that we have for you today. If you want to tell us something else, we're happy to hear.
No, the only thing I'm going to mention is that I really think you're going to enjoy. Okay, you got it too. It's a funny book with a lot of inspiring things in it. It's gotten very good reviews, and I recommend it highly to all of you out there who are aspiring scientists, physicians, or physician scientists. I cannot imagine a more gratifying career than I've had, and that can lie in the future for all of you.
We have another question for you.
Surprisingly.
People are very curious for your library. They are asking, which is your favorite book?
What is my favorite book? Well, it depends on whether we're talking fiction or nonfiction. So if we're talking fiction, and I don't read much fiction, but my favorite novel of all time is Don Quixote, which is far and away my favorite novel. In fact, I was reading Don Quixote. I had read it in college, but then I was actually reading it in 2012. I was on page 500 when I got the call from Stockholm. I know this, I may be off by a page or two. I know this because the book is 1,000 pages. And I was working my way through it and just loving it so much. And then the Nobel Prize happened. And for 2 years, I didn't look at the book. My life was so crazy and so hectic. But then after about 2 years, I came back to it and I finished it. And that remains my favorite novel. My favorite nonfiction books generally are in the category of biography. I love biographies of outstanding, preferably heroic figures. I'm currently working my way through about my third biography of Winston Churchill, who, the great wartime leader and premier of England, who one of the most amazing characters you're ever going to read about. But I've read many other biographies. So those are my two favorite kinds of books.
Thank you very much for all the answers. And I guess
That's all.
that's all we have.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lefkowitz. It was a
My
pleasure.
pleasure indeed. I hope you enjoyed the presentation, and I wish you all the very best of success in the future.
Thank you very much.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Entonces.
Muchas gracias por estar en la conferencia con nosotros.
Tanto virtual como presencial. Ahora en el auditorio Fundadores vamos a tener a la Orquesta Sinfónica de AFIT. Para los que están presencial no se la pueden perder. Y los que están acompañándonos de manera virtual, les agradecemos mucho su compañía y esperamos que les haya gustado mucho, que hayan aprendido mucho y que se animen a comprar el libro del Dr. Lefkowitz. Y otra vez, muchas gracias por venir. Esta semana seguiremos teniendo eventos de Home Science, entonces quédense súper pendientes tanto a nuestro YouTube como a Instagram.
Previo al evento tendremos la charla inaugural de nuestro presidente Alejandro Salazar y la introducción del PAFEST.
Muchas gracias.